Maya's phone wouldn't stop vibrating against the metal table, each buzz rattling her half-empty Starbucks cup like a warning. The lid had gone loose, and a thin line of coffee crept toward the edge, cold and bitter. She didn't look at the screen. She couldn't. Not with the crate finally open in front of her, salt still clinging to the wood like frost. The lab smelled like wet rope and old pennies. "Ready?" the crane operator asked through the glass, voice tinny over the speaker. Maya swallowed, throat tight. Her glove stuck to the tape as she peeled it back. Inside the crate was a smaller box, sealed with wax that had somehow survived 120 years underwater. Her coworker Jonah leaned in, eyes wide, like he was trying not to breathe. Maya lifted the lid. And there, on top of everything, was a modern-looking photo, glossy, clean, like it had been printed last week. Her heart stumbled like it missed a step. "That's impossible," Jonah whispered. Maya stared at the picture until her eyes started to burn, because the woman in it looked exactly like her. Maya Cortez hadn't planned on becoming the kind of person who measured her life by grant deadlines and overdue notices, but somehow that was where she landed. She lived in a narrow apartment in South Baltimore, where the radiator clanged like it had an opinion, and the walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's microwave beep through dinner. Most nights, she ate standing up at the counter because the table was buried under bills, lab reports, and a stack of unopened mail she pretended didn't exist. In the morning, she took the same route to the Maritime Conservation Lab near the harbor. The water looked calm from a distance, but up close it was always moving, always carrying something you couldn't see. The city around it felt the same way. People on sidewalks, heads down, earbuds in, coffee in hand, each one running some private math problem in their mind about time and money and what they could afford to feel today. Maya used to love the harbor. When she was a kid, her father would bring her here on Sundays, just to walk and talk. He'd tell her that water kept stories, that nothing was really gone, not in the way people thought. Back then, that idea felt comforting. Now it felt like pressure. Like if water kept stories, then so did people, and she was tired of carrying hers around. She was 34 and already felt older than her age. Her mother's health had been slipping for years, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, expensive way that didn't leave room for hero moments. Maya's mom could still laugh, still argue, still insist she was fine, but there were pills lined up on the kitchen counter like tiny reminders that fine didn't last by itself. Maya helped when she could, which was never as much as she wanted. She sent money when she could, which was even less. She had a job that sounded impressive if you said it fast. Marine conservator, artifact specialist, part of a team working on a major recovery project. But the pay didn't match the title, and the funding was always fragile. Half her friends from college had moved into tech or real estate, jobs with bonuses and office snacks and a kind of tiredness that came with choices. Maya's tiredness came with a tight chest and the feeling that her life was being held together with tape. Her phone was the worst part, because it never stopped asking her to be something. A good daughter. A responsive employee. A patient friend. A stable adult. It pinged with texts from her mom, from her landlord, from the student loan app that acted like it had a personality. That morning, she stood in the lab's break room staring at the screen, thumb hovering over an email from the hospital billing department. The subject line was polite. That was what got her. Statement available. Like it was a gift. Jonah walked in behind her, pulling his beanie off and shaking rain out of his hair. He was younger than Maya by maybe 6 years, and he still had the kind of face that looked surprised by responsibility. "You're here early," he said, opening the fridge. "I couldn't sleep," Maya answered, because it was easier than saying, "I keep waking up thinking I forgot something important." Jonah nodded like he understood, even if he didn't. He grabbed a yogurt, then paused and looked at her cup. "That coffee's from yesterday, isn't it?" Maya glanced down. She hadn't even noticed she'd brought it in. The green straw was bent at an awkward angle. "Yeah," she said. "I guess." He didn't make a joke. He didn't do the thing people did where they tried to brighten it with sarcasm. He just said, "We've got a long day. You want me to make a fresh pot?" Maya should have said no. She was used to saying no. No saved time. No saved energy. No saved you from feeling like you owed someone something. But she heard herself say, sure. It was a small kindness, the kind you could dismiss if you wanted to. Yet when Jonah set a mug near her, the steam rising like a quiet offer, Maya felt something in her chest loosen just a little. Not relief, exactly. More like permission to keep going for another hour. The recovery project was the reason everyone was tense. A ship had been found off the coast, an early 1900s passenger vessel that had gone down in a storm and never been recovered. The headlines loved the number, 120 years. It sounded clean and dramatic. The reality was slow work, planning meetings, legal approvals, cameras, sponsors, and a safety checklist that made the whole thing feel less like adventure and more like a complicated move. They weren't raising the ship in one piece like the movies. They were lifting sections and artifacts, carefully, with cranes and diverse and engineering support. Every item that came up had to be documented, stabilized, and treated like it could fall apart if you looked at it wrong. Most of what they pulled from the water looked like what you'd expect: rusted metal, waterlogged wood, a shoe with no match, glass bottles clouded by time. But the public didn't care about that. The public wanted a reveal. They wanted something shocking. They wanted a reason to feel something big without having to work for it. Maya understood the temptation. She felt it too, when she was alone on her couch at night scrolling through videos of other people's lives. People who got surprise promotions. People who found out they were related to someone famous. People whose problems wrapped up in a neat little arc with background music swelling at the end. Her own life didn't swell. It just continued. By noon, the lab was crowded with reporters behind a taped line, their shoes squeaking on the floor, their questions bouncing around like ping-pong balls. "Do you expect to find remains?" one asked, and Maya hated the word because it made everything sound like a mystery box. "Our focus is preservation and historical context," Maya said, voice steady because she'd practiced steady. "We're treating all recovered materials with respect." She said it like a professional, but inside she felt the familiar sharp twist of anger at how quickly people turned real human loss into content. After the cameras left, the lab felt quieter but not calmer. The day's main crate was due in the late afternoon, a section recovered from a sealed storage compartment. That was why the team had been hovering, checking tools, double-checking procedures, talking faster than usual. Maya tried to focus, but her mind kept sliding off the work like it couldn't get traction. She kept thinking about her mom's last phone call, the way her mother had said, "It's nothing, Mija," and how nothing always seemed to cost hundreds of dollars. Maya kept thinking about her own bank account, the number that never grew no matter how careful she was. She kept thinking about her ex Brian, who had left not in a screaming fight but in a slow drift, as if their life together had become one more bill he didn't want to open. When the crate finally arrived, the whole lab shifted. People moved with purpose, but their eyes were bright with the kind of hope they didn't say out loud. Even Maya felt it, that pull toward meaning. The box was heavier than it should have been, and the wood looked darker, saturated from time. Salt crystals stuck to the edges. The seal was intact, which meant whatever was inside had been protected from the open water more than most finds. Maya's phone buzzed again. She glanced down without thinking. A missed call from the hospital. Her stomach dropped, just for a second, before she forced herself back into the room. She put the phone face down. She could not do both things at once. She could not carry her mother's fear and this project's pressure at the same time. Jonah stood beside her, handing her the toolkit. "You okay?" he asked quietly, not as a coworker but as a person. Maya inhaled, tasted coffee and metal and the faint sourness of stress. "Yeah," she lied, because lying was faster. Then she nodded toward the crate. "Let's do it right." They worked slowly, hands steady, voices low. Tape peeled back with a soft tearing sound. The lid lifted with a reluctant creak, like it didn't want to let go. Inside was a smaller box, sealed with wax that looked strangely smooth for something that had been underwater for more than a century. Maya's skin prickled. Jonah leaned in, mouth slightly open, like a kid trying not to ruin a surprise. Maya lifted the lid. On top of everything was a glossy photo, clean, unwarped, modern. It didn't make sense. It looked like something from a Walgreens print kiosk, not a relic from 1905. Her breath caught so hard it almost hurt. Because the woman in the photo had Maya's same face. The same tired eyes. The same little scar near the eyebrow she'd gotten in middle school. And behind the woman was a hospital hallway. Maya's phone buzzed again, the sound sharp against the silence. Jonah's voice dropped to a whisper. Maya, how is that possible? Maya couldn't answer. Her hands started to shake, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something bigger than stress pushing up through her ribs. Not a miracle. Not a movie twist. Something else. Something that had been waiting. The first thing Maya did was step back. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't gasp or grab the table. She just took one small step away from the crate, like her body was trying to create space for her brain to catch up. The photo sat there quietly, glossy edges catching the lab lights, refusing to explain itself. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered, "Is this a prank?" The word hung in the air, uncomfortable and fragile. Maya picked up the photo with careful fingers, the way she handled everything fragile, whether it was a century-old artifact or a conversation she didn't want to have. The paper felt normal. Too normal. No water damage. No discoloration. She turned it over. On the back, written in blue pen, were 3 words. For when you're tired. Her chest tightened. She knew that handwriting. She hadn't seen it in years, but muscle memory didn't care about time. That needs to be logged, a supervisor said gently, stepping closer. We'll need to document how that ended up. It came from inside the sealed box, Jonah said quickly. The wax was intact. We all saw it. The supervisor nodded, but Maya could see the concern settle into her expression. This wasn't a headline anyone wanted to manage. Modern objects didn't belong in century-old shipwrecks. They broke the rules. They made people nervous. They moved the box to a secure table. Photos were taken. Notes were dictated. Maya went through the motions because she knew how to do that, because routine was something she could hold onto when her thoughts were slipping. But the photo stayed with her. Not physically, protocol required it to be stored, but mentally, like a low hum she couldn't turn off. During lunch, she sat on the concrete steps outside the lab, the harbor stretching out in front of her. The water looked flat and gray, the way it did when it couldn't decide what kind of mood it was in. She unwrapped a sandwich she didn't remember making and stared at it without appetite. Jonah sat down beside her, leaving space between them. He didn't ask questions right away. He just took a sip of his soda and watched a gull fight another gull over a scrap of something unidentifiable. That handwriting, he said finally. You recognized it. Maya nodded once. My grandmother's. Jonah didn't react the way people usually did when they heard something surprising. He didn't widen his eyes or say no way. He just waited. My mom's mom, Maya continued. She died when I was in college. We weren't close, exactly. She was the kind of person who loved in practical ways. Packed lunches. Notes in coat pockets. She didn't talk much about feelings. Jonah leaned back on his hands. And she somehow put a photo of you into a box that went down with a ship in the early 1900s. Maya let out a quiet breath that was almost a laugh. When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous. But it didn't feel ridiculous when you saw it. No, Maya said. It felt personal. The truth was, Maya had been tired for a long time. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixed. The kind that came from years of holding things together without acknowledgement. The note on the back of the photo felt like it had been written directly into that exhaustion. That afternoon, the lab director called her into a small office that smelled like lemon cleaner and old books. He closed the door, not in a secretive way, but in a considerate one. We're not accusing anyone of anything, he said, sitting across from her. But this is sensitive. We need to understand how that photo got there. Maya nodded. I understand. Did your grandmother have any connection to maritime work? Shipping companies? Archives? Maya shook her head. She worked at a public library. Most of her life. The director raised his eyebrows slightly. Archives, he repeated, thoughtful. Maya felt a small click inside her head, like two loose pieces finally touching. Her grandmother had spent decades cataloging donations, personal collections, letters people didn't know what to do with. She used to come home smelling like dust and old paper, complaining about mislabeled boxes. I need to make a call, Maya said. She stepped into the hallway and dialed her mom. It rang longer than usual, and Maya's heart did that thing where it tried to prepare for bad news before it arrived. Hi Mija, her mother said, voice thin but warm. Mom, Maya said, lowering her voice. Did Abuela ever work with donated maritime collections? Like personal effects from shipwrecks? There was a pause. Then a soft sound, like her mother shifting in her chair. Why are you asking? Please, Maya said. I just need to know. Well, her mother said slowly. There was a collection once. A family donated a box of letters and personal items from a ship that never made it. Abuela helped process it. She talked about it for weeks. Maya's grip tightened on the phone. What happened to the collection? It was transferred, her mother said. To a private preservation group, I think. Why? Maya closed her eyes. The lab lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed at a joke that had nothing to do with her life. Because, Maya said carefully, I think she put something in that box on purpose. Not back then. Later. Her mother was quiet. Abuela believed in leaving messages for the right moment, she said finally. She used to say some things shouldn't be found until you're ready. That night, Maya sat alone in her apartment, the radiator banging its usual complaint. She replayed memories she dismissed for years, her grandmother asking for recent photos, insisting on mailing things herself, saying, trust me, with a small, knowing smile. This wasn't a miracle. It wasn't time travel or fate bending the rules. It was a woman who understood systems, who knew how objects moved through institutions, who believed that preservation wasn't just about the past. It was about the future, too. Maya felt resistance rise up in her, sharp and familiar. Accepting this meant accepting that someone had seen her exhaustion coming, that she hadn't been as alone as she thought. She didn't know what the message meant yet. She didn't know why now. But for the first time in months, she didn't push the feeling away. She sat at her cluttered table, picked up a pen, and wrote down one sentence on a scrap of paper, just to see how it felt. I don't have to carry everything by myself. The words looked strange. Unfinished. But they stayed. The trouble with realizing you don't have to carry everything by yourself is that you still have to decide what to put down. Maya learned that the hard way over the next few days. The lab turned quieter, not calmer. Word about the photo didn't leak to the press, but it spread through the building in the subtle way things always did. Conversations paused when Maya walked by. People looked at her with curiosity that tried to disguise itself as concern. No one said anything unkind. That almost made it worse. She threw herself into work. Longer hours. Fewer breaks. She volunteered to stay late cataloging artifacts no one wanted to deal with yet. She told herself she was being responsible, that the project needed focus. But really, she was avoiding the space where thinking lived. At night, the apartment felt smaller. The radiator clanged. The fridge hummed. Her phone sat face up on the counter like it was watching her. She told herself she wouldn't check it. She checked it anyway. A voicemail from the hospital sat unopened. 3 days old now. Maya knew what would happen if she listened. She'd hear that careful, neutral tone people used when they were trying not to scare you. She'd hear numbers. Options. Next steps. All things that sounded manageable until you tried to live inside them. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the sink, staring out at the alley where a cat darted between trash bags. She thought about the note on the photo. For when you're tired. What if her grandmother hadn't meant physical tiredness at all? What if she'd meant this? The kind of exhaustion that came from always being the strong one. The reliable one. The person everyone assumed would figure it out. The next morning, Maya was late. Not dramatically late, but late enough that she had to jog from the bus stop, hair still damp, bag slapping against her hip. She burst into the lab just as Jonah was finishing a briefing with a visiting oversight rep. "You okay?" he asked when they had a second alone. "Yeah," she said automatically. Jonah didn't smile. "You don't have to say that every time." Maya opened her mouth to deflect, but the words got tangled. She felt heat creep up her neck. "I don't know what else to say." "You could say nothing," he offered. She let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting all morning. "I'm scared," she said quietly. "And I don't know what to do with that." Jonah nodded once, like she'd handed him something fragile and he was careful not to drop it. "That makes sense." That was it. No advice. No solution. Just acknowledgement. It landed harder than any pep talk ever had. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It crept in through small cracks. A mislabeled artifact that sent her into disproportionate frustration. A comment from a supervisor about budgets that made her jaw lock. A casual text from Brian asking how she'd been, like he hadn't walked away when things got complicated. That afternoon, Maya sat in the archive room alone, surrounded by shelves of items that had survived longer than anyone who owned them. She pulled a random box and opened it, just to keep her hands busy. Inside were letters. Not from the shipwreck project, but from another collection waiting its turn. She didn't read them closely, just glanced at the handwriting, the way people addressed each other with formality that still carried feeling underneath. She thought about her grandmother again. About how she'd chosen a job where stories passed through her hands without belonging to her. About how she'd still found ways to leave traces of care. Maya's phone buzzed. She froze. Then, slowly, she pressed play on the voicemail. The message was exactly what she expected. Updates. Adjustments. A reminder about follow-up appointments. The tone was calm, professional. It ended with, "Please call us back when you're able." Maya set the phone down and pressed her palms against her eyes. The room felt too quiet. The shelves felt like they were leaning in. Why was it so hard to let go of the idea that she had to manage this alone? Why did accepting help feel like admitting failure? She'd built her entire adult identity on being capable. On being the one who didn't fall apart. Her thoughts spiraled in that familiar loop. If she asked for help, she'd be a burden. If she slowed down, everything would slip. If she stopped holding it all together, there would be nothing underneath. Her breathing went shallow before she noticed it. The air felt thick, like she was pulling it through fabric. Her chest tightened, not with pain, but with pressure. Tears came fast, surprising her with their urgency. She slid down to the floor between the shelves, knees pulled in, forehead resting against the cool metal. It wasn't dramatic. No sobbing. Just quiet tears that soaked into her sleeve. This was the moment she'd been avoiding. The truth she didn't want to name. She wasn't tired because she was weak. She was tired because she'd been strong for too long without relief. When the tears slowed, Maya wiped her face and stayed where she was. She thought about the ship, sitting underwater for over a century, carrying its contents through pressure and darkness. It hadn't been preserved because it was invincible. It had been preserved because it was sealed, protected, supported by its environment in ways people didn't always see. Maybe people worked the same way. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Jonah. "I'm grabbing coffee. You want one?" Maya stared at the message. Her instinct was to say no. To handle it herself. To stand up, dry her face, and pretend this moment never happened. Her thumb hovered. Then she typed, Yes. Thank you. She leaned her head back against the shelf and closed her eyes, letting the decision settle. It didn't fix anything. The bills were still there. Her mom's health was still uncertain. The mystery of the photo was still unresolved. But the room felt a little less heavy. And for the first time, Maya didn't rush to stand up and prove she was okay. The coffee Jonah brought was nothing special. A plain drip in a cardboard cup with a smudged logo and a sleeve that slipped if you weren't careful. Maya noticed that because noticing small things was easier now. It kept her in the room. They sat in the break area without talking much. Jonah scrolled through his phone. Maya stared at the steam curling up and disappearing. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind that didn't ask anything from her. Later that day, she finally called the hospital back. She did it from her car, hands on the steering wheel, engine off. The air smelled faintly of old upholstery and rain. She listened. She asked questions. She wrote things down. When her voice shook, she didn't apologize for it. When she hung up, she sat there for a long minute, forehead resting against the wheel, breathing slow. Nothing had been solved. There was no sudden clarity, no perfect plan. But there was information. And for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed didn't turn her life around. They just nudged it. Maya told her supervisor she needed a flexible schedule for a while. She expected resistance. What she got instead was a tired nod and a quiet, "We'll make it work." She started splitting weekends between Baltimore and her mom's place, bringing groceries, sitting at the kitchen table while her mother talked about nothing important. Those afternoons mattered more than they looked like they should. She let Jonah help more at work. Not because she couldn't do the job, but because she didn't have to prove she could do it alone. They argued sometimes about methods and labels, but the arguments stayed about the work, not about who was stronger. The investigation into the photo moved forward in slow, procedural steps. Records were requested. Donation logs were reviewed. Eventually, the explanation became clear enough to stop feeling unreal. Maya's grandmother had worked with a private preservation group years after retiring. She'd helped reorganize a set of personal effects tied to the ship. She had known the box would eventually be returned to public hands, reclassified, re-entered into the system. She had placed the photo inside during that window. Not as a trick. As a message. The note on the back made sense now in a way it hadn't before. It wasn't prophecy. It was recognition. A woman who had lived a long, quiet life had seen a familiar pattern in her granddaughter and chosen to intervene in the only language she knew: objects, timing, patience. The lab released a carefully worded statement when the story finally went public. Experts explained the chain of custody. Commentators debated ethics. Online, people argued about whether it ruined the mystery or made it better. Maya didn't read most of it. What mattered happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. She was back in her apartment, the radiator still clanging, the table still cluttered. But she was sorting through the mail instead of stacking it. One envelope at a time. She paused when she felt overwhelmed. She kept going anyway. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mom. "Thank you for coming this weekend. I slept better." Maya smiled, small and real. She taped a copy of the photo inside a drawer, not hidden, not displayed. Just placed where she'd find it when she needed it. The note stayed with it. "For when you're tired." She thought about the ship again, how it hadn't been raised to be admired whole, but piece by piece, carefully, with respect for what it had been through. Recovery didn't erase the damage. It acknowledged it. That felt right. Maya wasn't suddenly fearless. She still worried about money. She still felt lonely some nights. She still had days where getting out of bed felt heavier than it should. But she no longer mistook endurance for isolation. The small win was this: she asked for help before she broke. She answered the phone instead of letting it buzz itself quiet. She let someone sit with her in silence without turning it into a performance. On her way to work one morning, she stopped by the harbor. The water moved the same way it always had, carrying things forward, whether anyone noticed or not. She took a breath and felt it go all the way in. Some stories aren't meant to shock. They're meant to remind you that persistence doesn't always look loud, and healing doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just shows up, quietly, right when you're tired enough to listen. If this story connected with you, share what you've been carrying alone. Someone else might recognize themselves in it, and that recognition can be the beginning of something better.